I'm John Mortimer, and I'm talking about test and learn. It's a method and approach to developing innovative solutions to organizational problems and creating real transformation and reform. What is interesting is that many have tried this, but few have actually understood how to make it work as intended. Starting with what it is, I will describe what I have learned about test and learn after over 20 years of lots of organizational trials and tribulations. I've either led or been a significant part of 34 test and learn service redesigns in the public sector and many in the private sector. Test and learn is a method, but it's also a way of thinking. We'll be using examples to highlight this that you can then take away to use yourself. Where do we start? Well, we're going to start in the 1950s. At that time, the United Kingdom was the second largest car manufacturer in the world, and it was the largest motorcycle manufacturer in the world. What happened? Well, in the 1960s, the Japanese began to dominate the auto industry with their products. And what was different about what they did? There were several things, but one of the main things was test and learn. Let's just take a very simplistic example. In the UK, typically to develop a new car, it would take about 2 years. In Japan, it would take about 6 months, and the cars were more reliable. Why was that? Well, at the top half of this slide, you can see that the process is sequential in that different parts of manufacturing and design would actually happen one after the other. And at each point, there would be arguments and there would be rejections of specifications. Organizations that were based in Japan, what they did was that they had people from each of those areas and they grouped them together into a development team and they worked together. That's the difference. And one example that I remember being told was that in the US, there was a driver that had got their shoe a little bit stuck on the accelerator pedal, and they complained to the dealer. The dealer asked for those shoes and sent her a pair of new shoes. They sent the shoes back to the manufacturer, who looked at them and realized that they could have changed the design of the accelerator pedal, which they then did. And they put that design in the car model within a few months. There was a model of Jaguar in the UK that when you bought it after a period of time, it wasn't uncommon that the wing mirror would drop off. That remained the situation. Why were we thinking that way? Well, if you ever looked at the £20 note that came out of circulation about 3 or 4 years ago, you'll notice that in the middle of that note, there is some text that says the division of labour in pin manufacturing. Now, this was something that developed in the 1700s, together with a formulation of how organizations should work. And what they did is that they took the end-to-end process of how to develop something or manufacture something and split it up into individual expert functions where people just did a particular part of the end-to-end work. It created huge efficiencies, but if you take that concept into designing new products, you end up where we were in the UK in the 1960s. Test and learn is a very valuable part of engineering design. With the Apollo space mission, for instance, the reason that it was so successful is that it developed by creating failures. That's how we learn what works, but in particular, what we need to change to make it work. And if you look at the different models of test and learn, there are several out there, and this is one of the more simplistic that's used in manufacturing, where you go around that circle several times to develop the end product. But it's not the method that I want to talk about in this video. What I really want to talk about is how does this apply to services? Also, in addition, what's behind this? What actually makes it work? Why is it so difficult for us to do this? Because still today, there's a lot of industry and there's a lot of service design that does not do this. Let me talk about how I do this when I go into an organization. And this isn't, of course, the only way, but this is a way that was taught to me. And where I start is I go into the work, and I go into the work with a small team of frontline people. And we sit next to those who are doing the work, and we start at the beginning where the demand comes in, and we look at what they do, we look at what happens to the work, we understand the problems they have, we look at what they put onto the IT systems, and I learn all of that. We go end to end from the very beginning to the very end. And over time, we develop a map of the work itself. Now, this isn't a process map. This is a map of the actual workflow, what really happens, the communication, the behaviors, the issues, the mistakes, the errors, and all the bureaucracy is in this map. And what we're doing is we're learning about how the current work works, and we're learning about how the whole system holds together and makes people behave in the certain way that they do behave. And as a slight aside, after doing this for so long, it came up upon 4 different ways of designs of services that we need to really be aware of, because each needs a different approach to designing and changing that service. So the first one, which is the really obvious one, is a simple transactional service like buying something online. Another one is a simple one, but many different types. So a high variety of demand that comes into these services. The third one is where expertise is required to answer that demand, let's say tech support. And the fourth one is, which is very interesting because a lot of the public sector, this is actually characteristic of that, complex services and complex demands. This is where we need to understand. And it's sometimes not particularly easy to understand because there's a whole myriad of issues that are part of that demand and need for the service. So to give an example, when I was working in health and social care, I asked a frontline person who was there to receive calls from people who need help. When you are talking to someone on the phone, what's in your head? What are you doing? What are you thinking? And they explained it to me. And I have to say, I didn't really understand what they were saying. It didn't make too much sense to me. What I asked them to do is to fill that out on a piece of paper the next morning, and then let's have a look. And this is what they filled out. What does it tell me? Well, the first thing it told me is that is not actually listening to the person who's talking. What they're doing is they're trying to fit them into one of these boxes. They only had a choice of one box, and that was what was in their head. And that pattern there was changing all the time. Every few weeks it would change. That's what they were doing, and that's what they were struggling with. That was their main job. This is an example of, I'm not just looking at the work, I'm looking for what's behind the work. How is the current design of the service being developed? What's the principles and concepts behind? And you can see here that that comes out quite clearly in this diagram. And what we also do is we also look at the flow, as I mentioned before. And this is an example of just one case that's gone end to end over a period of about 2 years of someone in health and social care, with all their interactions all on that flow. And this is a summary of a completely different service, actually. This is housing allocations, where we summarize the whole flow into one picture. When I go into an organization, I do have a method that I will use. Now, generally speaking, I use this as the basic framework in my work. It consists of 3 steps. But with test and learn, that's the central one. That's the one in the middle. So that's the one we're going to be focusing on in this video. I did mention the word innovation, and test and learn and innovation go hand in hand together. What's innovation? Well, before we start test and learn, let's just put down some ideas about what really makes successful innovation. We have to engage with what's going on. We have to immerse ourselves in the work. We have to understand what's behind the work. What's the logic, the patterns, the paradigms? And sometimes we can notice what the potential for the redesign actually is going to be just by doing that, like in the previous example. Innovation is about experimentation, pushing the boundaries and learning, blocking out critical aspects of how the current organization works to allow us to innovate and experiment. This design isn't something that we know what it's going to be at the beginning. It emerges over time, and quite often it's different to what we actually thought we were going to do at the beginning of this process. When I have this team of people and we start the test and learn, the first thing I do is I ask a senior person to come in to give the team permission. Now, the team are made up of frontline people from across that service. They're not just one specialism, they're across the service. And what they need from the senior person is permission to experiment without the restrictions of the current organization, without the restrictions of policies, procedures, current thinking, current rules. They're allowed to do things they're not normally allowed to do. And that's really important, because if you don't do that, they're going to be constrained by their current ways of working. And what I then do is we work with a set of new principles for the team. And these are generally the principles that I use. Now, when we apply these principles, we're going to apply these principles to the new set of demands. So we're going to go to where the demands come in, and we're going to take those demands one by one into the team, and the team will deal with those demands using these principles. So the first principle is understand what matters for each person. This is going to determine how we take that person through in the new flow. We make decisions based on knowledge and evidence, not opinions or standards or what other managers think. We only do what's needed to create value, to achieve the purpose of the service. We're not going to add in bureaucracy. We're not going to do things that we don't need to do. We're going to take ownership of the demand and that person from the very beginning to the very end of their journey, right across as far as we can in the organization. We may, in fact, be going across other organizations, even though the people in the room may not have the ability and the roles to be able to do that. We're going to work as a team. Although people will come in with their own roles that they have had and expertise, we don't want them to be restricted to those roles. And they come in without departmental barriers. And the team is there to learn. It's not there to design. It's not there to come up with a new design. Not yet. That comes later. That's really important, because even that restricts them from coming up with innovative approaches. So we're only here to learn. We do have a couple of rules, and the first rule is we don't break the law. And the second one is we don't make the person's situation worse, and we give a better level of service than we would have done in the current system. Those rules are written up and they stay on the wall for the whole time. And one of my main jobs is to ensure that the team stick to those principles, because certainly at the beginning, they will be reverting back to their way of thinking. I'm there to always pull them away from that. You can look online and see a myriad of different methods and approaches for test and learn, and this is one of them. And this is one from the Griffith Centre for System Innovation in Australia. If you just follow this, that's not test and learn. Test and learn is about learning, but it's also about reflecting and how we do that in an innovative way. Reflecting is by far the more difficult part. So let's start with a real example here. So this is the planning application process. This is the beginning of it, where applications come in, and they come in with drawings. And what we found very quickly is that over 50% of those applications fail and are sent back to the agent that supplied the drawings in the first place. Not only that, when we spoke to the agents, they were very frustrated with the planning department. When you follow the flow and look at this work, you realize that the planners are following a set of rules, or at least that's what they tell me. And this was the set of rules that they were referencing. And they said, yeah, we have to use this. And I asked the question, but do you actually need to use these rules to start working on a planning application? I said, no, we don't, but this is what we're given. It's legislation. So when I went and looked at the original source material, we found that it actually wasn't the legislation at all. It was guidance. Now, guidance is just what it says. You can do it if you want. So immediately in the team, we decided to put that aside, and we decided to, whatever we thought was appropriate, that we would look at the drawings and we would deal with them in the way that was most appropriate. And that's what we did. So what I'm going to show you next are different types of service designs that I've been part of. So as the demands come in, we start to record them down on the wall on flip charts, and we create our own columns as to what we want to record. And the room itself over time gets quite busy. So this is just an example of one of the walls. And on this one, you can see that on the top left-hand side, we've got the demands that came in. This is housing voids, which is where you've got tenants that are leaving a house The house then needs to be renovated or work done to it, and then new tenant needs to move in. You can see that on the bottom, you've got the emergent design that starts to be developed as we move forward over time. Now, at one point, when I was working with this team, I was really surprised. I came back and they had already started not even taking out boxes, but coming up with a new design. And you can see that the new design on the bottom was quite different, had a lot less activity in it than the top one. And that's what happens when the team get focused on the principles, I find, is that they really get involved in this and they start to realize that they've got the ability and the power to come up with their new design. And that does take a little bit of time. And it's really important that the environment is created to allow that to happen. This is a safe environment for them. If they have any issues or problems with regard to that, I'm the one that needs to help resolve those. We very often include the manager and the decision makers in this, and they're normally part-time in the team. So that interaction has to be managed and developed quite carefully. But I'll go into a bit of that later on. This is another example, health and social care, where we put the demands on the wall. There was so much information that we had to use the whole wall. And in the same team, this is an example of the measures that they were starting to record to help us to understand the techniques that we were trying, which ones were more successful than others. So we had to get good evidence. What was interesting is actually the outcomes were quite difficult to record here because the outcomes were down to people themselves dealing with things. And there were very often it was done away from us. So we were more focused on the number of handoffs, the number of referrals to other people, the waste in the system, the bureaucracy, the amount of record keeping, the amount of work that had to be redone, and the total amount of effort that went into doing this. And what was really important is that this was a fundamental part of demonstrating to decision makers how appropriate the learning was that we were doing. But at the end of it, more importantly, what do we think is the ideal design that we can then take forward into a prototype? Because that's the next stage after test and learn. It's a prototype. And these are just some examples. And on the bottom diagram, you can see the old design of the sort of, this is just a high level flow of how it worked. And above it was the new design. And although this doesn't mean very much to you, I'm just showing you this because a team member would show a decision maker these and would talk about each one directly in the room so that they could have a discussion about what the differences were. This is an example of the measures that the team were experimenting with. We wanted to find out how could we measure outcomes. And in the end, by the way, we ended up deciding we couldn't, but we tried, and that's part of test and learn. In terms of recording the measures, we wanted to record performance of the flow as well. Of course, that's part of what I was saying. Now, it's important here to compare. It's not just about what are we learning and what are the measures, but compare that to what the current system does and how it was before. So you can see here a significant shift in some of the measures in the experiment. As those points in the experiment go up or down, it tells us how successful or not we are in terms of the techniques that we're using. What we have on this slide are two graphs. The bottom graph shows the difference between the old and new way of working, a bit like the previous one we just saw, with test and learn demonstrating remarkable shifts in performance. The top graph is a little bit different. It shows when we have applied different tests within an experiment, and the learning comes from understanding the different patterns that we can actually see there. So in the end, I come up with a different way of using measures than the current way of doing it, which is the first one is they should be derived from purpose and what matters to the user. They're in the hands of those that are doing the work, so they are permanently in the room, on the wall. They demonstrate variation. What that means is that they measure individual instances. We're not talking about trying to average things out here because that hides anything that we're looking at. And they're used to help to understand and learn. They're not used to monitor. And so if a measure goes in a positive direction or a negative direction, it doesn't matter to us because each of those will show us what we're actually learning. And that's the point. That's one of the big changes in thinking, is that there's no good or bad in this. In fact, it's quite funny to see how the more mistakes and the more failures, or the worse it gets, the more learning the team actually have. And when we deal with complexity, we immerse ourselves in that complexity. We make sense of what's going on in the work, and we try something out. And we start going around that loop maybe several times. And that's one of the characteristics of how we deal with complexity and change. One of the ways of solving problems or looking at situations and designing them is that if we have a problem, we can fix it. And we're all happy because the outcome is a positive outcome. But what this is about, what test and learn is about, is not just that. Actually, we're interested in what are the assumptions behind why we got the problem in the first place? Where are the causes of the problem? How can we design this service so that we don't have the problem? So we look at the assumptions as to what's behind the problems. We feed that into the techniques of how we design. So that's where the learning and reflection comes in. And that's what we find actually quite difficult to do. So remember this, the team decided not to use the assessment forms. I think they had 68 pages of assessment forms. They would normally be told to use them. We decided to go to someone's house and we decided to just listen and record things down in a notepad. And then we came back and we wondered, how would we record that? And this is how they recorded it. They got a sheet of flip chart and they put the key aspects of what we had just learned on there and how they linked up. And they discovered that such a simple diagram was far better than what they'd done before. Not only was this really helpful to see how everything fitted together, but it was great to be able to share with other people in the organization. And then we actually took this back to Len and showed him, and he was absolutely bowled over. And it started to help him to see how the complex issues in his life all fitted together. So actually, this diagram was hugely important. We didn't know that at the time, but we discovered that. And that's an example of what real test and learn is actually about. And this is really about moving from analysis and reductionism of analysis to sense making and looking at patterns. So it's about making complex information, content, and situations understandable with the people in the system itself. And I sometimes say it's about making the invisible visible. Those things that we know happen in the organization but are never written down anywhere, and we can't really just point to them because they're just there. The way we work, the culture that we work within, for instance. And data and information and knowledge. So what do I do when I come across data? Well, the first thing I do is I go and find out how accurate it is. The second thing I do is I ask myself, how well does it represent what it is meant to represent? I go and find out. What is it telling us? So I go and work with the people in the work to find that out. You find that individuals will record data for different reasons, and they've been told to as well. And very often they simplify and they categorize things. When you categorize them or simplify them, they lose a lot of their meaning. In the example with health and social care, for instance, we found that 66% of the information that was recorded about a person did not reflect the causes of the problem to be solved. Therefore, if we simply use the data to focus our efforts on, we would be doing the wrong thing 66% of the time. Now, if you really think about that, that's really a significant learning that we in the team got that we had no idea about. We had an idea that when we were trying to help people, it wasn't working, but we didn't know that actually one of the key reasons is because it was down to that. So we are normally very familiar with explicit types of knowledge that are in the hierarchy and in data structures, but we're not so familiar very often with the implicit information that we actually do need, the more hidden information that's more in terms of the networks within the organizations. But actually, that's really what I'm looking for. I'm looking more at the right-hand side as much as the left-hand side. This is an example here of when we were in health and social care and we wanted to understand what mattered to people. In the end, we were creating diagrams like this, which we find immensely useful because the person themselves would be creating the reasons why they couldn't live a good life. So this was driven by the user, not us. And that's a fundamental shift in the way of working, especially in the public sector. And this was so valuable to us. And we realized that actually what you see there is actually the main information that we held about someone. All the information we needed to take them through the end-to-end was held in that slide there. I want to mention one last thing here. The work with the decision makers and the manager of the service was really important. They were part of the team, maybe not full time. On the left-hand side, you can see a diagram of how the relationship between the manager and the front line often is. But actually what we want to do is shift it to the right-hand side, an equal footing, no hierarchy in the room. The managers and decision makers are there to learn just as much as everybody else. And this is really key. I put more effort and more focus on that than working with the team, because if that doesn't work, then we're not going to get anywhere with a new design. I've summarized the main learning that I've got that I'd like to talk to you about now. The first one is, this is about understanding first and discovering the real problem to solve, rather than just the one we've been given. And the one that we've been given, is it really customer focused, or is it what the organization wants for themselves, like cutting costs? Those two are very different things, and we need to understand what the decision makers actually want. And this is about co-designing in the work with those that do the work. It's not about me or anyone else designing in a room and then going and talking to frontline people and coming back. When we do this, we have to be separate from the current conditions within the organization. We have to develop new principles, way of working. And in the end, we develop a new working culture that is very different to how the people in the front line have been working before. And we have to learn how to learn. Actually, it's surprising how we don't know how to do that. We have to challenge our own assumptions. One of my key roles is to make that happen over time. It doesn't just happen overnight. It is about sense making. It's about moving from data and analysis to sense making. It's about using measures to prove the learning and demonstrate to others. And it is about changing the way that we work and the way that we behave. And I quickly put together another list here, which is, it's a different way of thinking. And that's why it hasn't really worked before. And that's why we struggle in this country to do test and learn, even though it was been around since the 1960s. Number 12, it's the organization and the people. It's not a product. It's not a thing that you can just do. Number 13, go to where they're doing it well. Don't copy, spend time there to learn. So there are usually other places that are actually doing great innovative work. Go there and find out what they're doing. And it's not just about learning, it's about reflecting. And reflecting is the more difficult one. You sometimes need an outside facilitator like me. That's what I do. I help them to shed the recurring themes that they get back to, like GDPR and all these other things. Find out those that are criticizing our service and complaining and moaning that we're doing the wrong thing. Go and talk to them. Go and engage with them and find out, understand where they're coming from. They normally have a very useful and interesting perspective that we would get good value from. Well, I've finished my piece now, and I hope you were able to take some of those elements and put it into your work. I'm not expecting people to suddenly work this way, because there's a whole load of different ways of working in there that you might not be able to suddenly do. But I'm hoping that at least some of them you'll be able to incorporate in your work. Please don't hesitate to contact me if you have anything else that you'd like to talk about. If you agree or disagree with this, that would be great. And if you want to take this further with me, it'd be really good to have a further conversation. Thank you.